When a racist teacher kicks a young black girl out of class, he thinks his authority is untouchable. But what he doesn't know is that her father isn't just any parent. He's the one man who holds the power to completely change this teacher's life forever. What happens next is a jaw-dropping lesson in justice, racism, and accountability. The bell rang, echoing through the halls of Pinecrest Academy, signaling the start of another school day. Young Amaya Johnson, a bright-eyed 12-year-old, walked into her classroom clutching her books tightly against her chest. She was a quiet child, often lost in her thoughts, but her radiant smile spoke volumes about her spirit. Today, however, was different. She felt the weight of the stares, the whispered comments from classmates that lingered as she took her seat in the middle of the room. Her teacher, Mr. Harold Bennett, a tall, imposing man in his late 40s, stood at the front of the class. He was known for his strict demeanor and biting remarks, but today, his gaze seemed particularly sharp as it landed on Amaya. "Amaya," Mr. Bennett called out, his voice laced with an edge that made the room go silent. "Is there a reason you've chosen to grace us with your presence today instead of being late like yesterday?" Amaya's cheeks burned. "I wasn't late yesterday, sir," she replied softly, her voice steady but quiet. Mr. Bennett raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with disdain. "Oh, so now you're challenging me in my own classroom? Is that it?" The other students sat frozen, their eyes darting between Amaya and Mr. Bennett. The tension was palpable. Amaya looked down, gripping her pencil so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her voice caught in her throat. "Stand up," Mr. Bennett barked, pointing toward her. Amaya hesitated, but slowly rose from her seat, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on her. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice low but venomous. "In my classroom, respect is earned, not given. And if you think you can talk back to me, you're sorely mistaken." Tears stung the corners of Amaya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had heard stories about Mr. Bennett, how he seemed to single out certain students, how his punishments always seemed harsher for kids who looked like her. She had hoped it wouldn't happen to her. "You know what?" Mr. Bennett continued, his voice rising. "I don't think this is the right class for you. Get out. Go to the principal's office. Maybe they can teach you some manners there." The words hit her like a slap. Amaya stood frozen, her mind racing. She glanced around the room, searching for any sign of support from her classmates, but no one dared to speak. Slowly she gathered her belongings and walked toward the door, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the whispers that erupted behind her. As she reached the door, Mr. Bennett's voice stopped her. "And don't bother coming back until you've learned your place." Amaya stepped out into the hallway, her hands trembling as she clutched her books. The familiar school she had once loved now felt foreign and hostile. She wiped at her eyes, trying to collect herself, but the tears kept coming. What Mr. Bennett didn't know, what none of her classmates knew, was that Amaya's father wasn't just a regular parent. He was the new school inspector, a man who had recently taken charge of evaluating the teachers and systems at Pinecrest Academy. And though Amaya was too heartbroken to think about it now, her father would soon learn what had happened. Little did Mr. Bennett realize, his actions had set in motion events that would change everything, for him, for Amaya, and for the entire school. Amaya's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as she made her way to the principal's office. She bit her lip, trying to stifle the sobs threatening to escape. Her mind swirled with questions. Why had Mr. Bennett been so cruel? What had she done to deserve this humiliation? By the time she reached the office, her hands were trembling. Mrs. Daniels, the school secretary, looked up from her desk, her face softening when she saw Amaya's tear-streaked cheeks. "Amaya, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, standing up from her chair. Amaya hesitated. The words felt stuck in her throat, as though saying them aloud would make the pain even more real. "Mr. Bennet sent me here," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Daniels frowned, concern flashing across her face. "Did he say why?" Amaya shook her head, clutching her books tighter. "He said I needed to learn my place." The secretary's expression hardened, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Come, sit down for a moment. I'll call the principal." Amaya sank into one of the waiting chairs, her legs feeling like jelly. She stared at the floor, her mind replaying the scene over and over. A part of her wished she could just disappear, to avoid the stares and whispers she knew would follow her when she returned to class. Just as Mrs. Daniels picked up the phone, the door to the office swung open, and in walked a tall man in a sharp navy blue suit. His presence was commanding, yet his warm smile and kind eyes immediately softened the room. It was Amaya's father, Marcus Johnson. "Good morning, Mrs. Daniels," Marcus said, his deep voice steady. But the moment his gaze landed on his daughter, his smile vanished. "Amaya? What's going on?" Amaya froze, her lip trembling. Seeing her father brought all the emotions rushing back. She didn't want to cry in front of him, but the tears came anyway. Marcus crouched down beside her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "Talk to me. What happened?" Amaya hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Daniels, who gave her an encouraging nod. Finally, she took a shaky breath and told him everything. How Mr. Bennet had singled her out, how he'd mocked her, and how he'd kicked her out of class. By the time she finished, Marcus's jaw was tight, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a quiet fury. He stood, towering over the room, and turned to Mrs. Daniels. "Where is Mr. Bennet's classroom?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Mrs. Daniels hesitated. "Mr. Johnson, I understand your frustration, but maybe we should involve the principal." "I'm not here as a parent right now," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. "I'm here as the school inspector, and I need to see this teacher immediately." Amaya's eyes widened. She had forgotten, in the haze of her emotions, that her father's role gave him authority over the entire school. While she felt a flicker of hope, she also worried about what would happen next. Mrs. Daniels nodded, sensing that this wasn't the time to argue. "Room 204, down the hall to the left." Marcus turned back to Amaya, his expression softening. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll handle this." Amaya nodded, watching as her father walked out the door, with purpose in his stride. She wiped her tears, a small spark of comfort warming her chest. For the first time that morning, she felt like she wasn't alone. Inside room 204, Mr. Bennet was in the middle of a lecture when the door swung open. The classroom fell silent as Marcus stepped inside. His imposing figure and sharp suit were a stark contrast to the mundane setting of the room. "Mr. Bennet?" Marcus said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made the teacher look up immediately. "Yes?" Mr. Bennet replied, his brow furrowing. "Can I help you?" "You certainly can," Marcus said, his tone still controlled. "I'm Marcus Johnson, the school inspector, and I'd like to have a word with you." The colour drained from Mr. Bennet's face. He glanced around at the students who were now staring at him with wide eyes. "Of course," he stammered, clearing his throat. "Should we step outside?" Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No need. I think the students deserve to hear this." The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus stepped further inside, his gaze locking onto Mr. Bennet. "I've just spoken with my daughter, Amaya," he began, his voice steady but carrying an edge. "She told me about your behavior this morning. Care to explain why you thought it was appropriate to humiliate a student and kick her out of class?" Mr. Bennet's mouth opened, but no words came out. The room felt suffocatingly quiet. Marcus took a step closer, his presence towering over the teacher. "Let me be clear, Mr. Bennett," he said, his tone cutting through the silence. "In my role, I've dealt with many educators. Most of them are dedicated, compassionate, and respectful. But your actions, they have no place in this school, or any school." The classroom was frozen in silence. Mr. Bennett shifted uncomfortably, beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. The students sat wide-eyed, exchanging glances but not daring to speak. Marcus's commanding presence filled the room, and his words carried the weight of a reckoning that none of them could ignore. "I asked you a question, Mr. Bennett," Marcus continued, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "What justification do you have for kicking my daughter out of your class?" Mr. Bennett cleared his throat, forcing a weak smile that barely masked his unease. I didn't realize Amaya was your daughter, sir. If I had—" Marcus raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Stop right there," he said, his tone now firm enough to make the teacher flinch. "Whether she's my daughter or not is irrelevant. She's a student in your class, and your responsibility is to teach her, not to humiliate her, not to target her, and certainly not to kick her out for no valid reason." The words hung heavy in the air. A few students lowered their gazes, as if afraid to make eye contact with the teacher who had spent the year lording his authority over them. "You seem to have a pattern, Mr. Bennett," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a steely calm. "From what I've observed in this school, and from what I've now experienced firsthand, you have a habit of singling out students like Amaya. Would you care to explain why that is?" Mr. Bennett's face turned crimson. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't know what you're implying." Marcus stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "I think you do." The classroom's silence was deafening. A boy in the back shifted uncomfortably, his chair scraping against the floor. Marcus turned his attention briefly to the students, softening his expression. "Let me ask you all something," Marcus said, addressing the room. "How many of you have ever felt unfairly treated in this classroom? Singled out, mocked, or made to feel like you don't belong?" The students hesitated. They glanced at each other, uncertain whether to speak up. Slowly, one hand went up, then another, and another. Before long, nearly half the class had their hands raised. Marcus turned back to Mr. Bennett, whose face was now a shade of pale that almost matched the chalkboard behind him. "This is what I mean," Marcus said, gesturing to the students. "These kids are here to learn. They're not here to endure your biases or to be torn down by your words." "Mr. Johnson, I assure you," Mr. Bennett stammered, "any disciplinary actions I take are purely in the interest of maintaining order in my classroom." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Order? Kicking out a student for defending herself is maintaining order. Singling her out because of your own prejudices is maintaining order." He shook his head, his voice rising slightly. "No, Mr. Bennett. What you're doing is abusing your position of power, and it ends today." The tension in the room was unbearable, but Marcus wasn't finished. He turned to the students again, his voice softening. "Amaya is my daughter," he began, his tone taking on an emotional weight. "But she's not just my daughter. She's your classmate, your peer. She's a bright, curious girl who loves to learn. And today she walked into this room ready to do just that. But instead of encouragement, she was met with cruelty. That's not just wrong, it's heartbreaking." Amaya, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, peeked into the classroom. Marcus noticed her and gestured for her to come in. "Come here, sweetheart," he said gently. Amaya hesitated, but the warmth in her father's voice gave her the courage to step forward. She stood beside him, her head held a little higher now. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "This young lady deserves respect, just like every other student in this classroom. And Mr. Bennett, you owe her an apology." Mr. Bennett swallowed hard, His gaze flickered between Marcus and Amaya, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders. I'm sorry, Amaya, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. Amaya looked at him, her eyes glistening with a mix of emotions. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice steady but still carrying the hurt she had endured. Marcus turned back to Mr. Bennet, his tone firm again. An apology is a start, but it's not enough. As the school inspector, I'm placing you under review. Your actions will be thoroughly investigated, and appropriate measures will be taken. The students exchanged astonished glances. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen someone hold Mr. Bennet accountable. This school is meant to be a safe space for learning, Marcus continued, addressing the room. That starts with ensuring every teacher, every administrator, and every staff member upholds the values of respect and equality. I won't tolerate anything less. As Marcus finished speaking, the bell rang, signaling the end of class. The students began gathering their belongings, their eyes lingering on Amaya and her father. For the first time, some of them approached her, offering quiet words of encouragement and smiles of solidarity. As Amaya and Marcus walked out of the classroom together, she looked up at him, a small smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Dad, she said softly. Marcus smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. You never have to thank me for standing up for you, sweetheart. That's what I'm here for. But as they left the school, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about Amaya. It was about creating a school where no child would have to endure what she did ever again. The drive home was quiet, but the air between Marcus and Amaya was filled with an unspoken understanding. Amaya leaned her head against the car window, watching the scenery blur past, her mind still processing everything that had happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel alone. Marcus glanced at her, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His heart ached for his daughter, for what she had endured. He thought back to his own childhood, where moments of prejudice had left scars that took years to heal. He had promised himself long ago that he would protect his children from those same wounds. Today had tested that promise. You okay, kiddo? He asked softly, breaking the silence. Amaya turned her head toward him, her eyes glistening but calm. Yeah, she said quietly. I don't get why he hates me so much. I didn't do anything wrong. Marcus's chest tightened. You didn't, he said firmly. None of this is your fault, Amaya. Some people let their own insecurities and biases blind them. It's wrong, and it's unfair, but it's not about you. It's about them. Amaya nodded, her father's words sinking in, but the pain lingered. Do you think he'll change? She asked hesitantly. Marcus sighed. I hope so, he said honestly. But change doesn't come easy, especially for someone like Mr. Bennet. What matters is that you stood strong, even when he tried to tear you down. And now it's my job to make sure he's held accountable. Amaya gave him a small smile. Thanks, Dad. That evening, Marcus sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of papers and reports. His laptop screen glowed faintly as he typed up an official review of Mr. Bennet's behavior. Each word was carefully chosen, every detail from Amaya's account and the students' reactions meticulously documented. But it wasn't enough to stop with Mr. Bennet. Marcus knew this issue was bigger than one teacher. If prejudice had found its way into Pinecrest Academy, it was likely rooted deeper than anyone wanted to admit. He picked up the phone and dialed Principal Harris. Marcus, the principal greeted warmly on the other end. How's Amaya doing? She's shaken, but she's strong, Marcus replied. That's not why I'm calling, though. We need to talk about Mr. Bennet and the culture at this school. Principal Harris hesitated. I was afraid this might come up, he admitted. I've heard complaints before, but nothing ever concrete enough to act on. He's been with us for over a decade and… Marcus cut him off. That's part of the problem, Harris. How many students have been silenced because they thought nothing would change? How many have walked away feeling powerless because no one was willing to stand up for them? The principal sighed heavily. You're right, Marcus. I've let this go on too long. What do you suggest? I suggest a full evaluation of the school's policies, starting with diversity and inclusion training for every teacher and staff member, Marcus said firmly. And as for Mr. Bennett, he needs to be suspended immediately while we conduct a thorough investigation. If we're going to call ourselves educators, we need to create an environment where every child feels safe and valued. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Principal Harris finally spoke. You've got my support, Marcus. Let's set up a meeting to address this first thing tomorrow. Marcus hung up, feeling a small sense of satisfaction. This was only the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. The next morning, Marcus walked into Pinecrest Academy with a renewed sense of purpose. The school hallways buzzed with the usual morning energy, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Whispers followed him as he made his way to the principal's office. Is that her dad? One student murmured. Yeah, the school inspector, another replied. Did you hear what he said to Mr. Bennett yesterday? Marcus paid the whispers no mind. His focus was on the task ahead. As he entered the principal's office, he was greeted by Principal Harris, along with a small team of staff members. Marcus, Harris said, standing to shake his hand. Thank you for coming in. Let's get to work. The meeting lasted hours, delving into the school's culture, disciplinary policies, and the complaints against Mr. Bennett. Marcus shared his observations and insights, pushing for meaningful changes that would make the school a better place for students like Amaya. As the meeting wrapped up, Harris turned to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. You know, this might be the wake-up call we all needed. I hate that it came at the expense of your daughter, but I'm grateful you're here to help us fix this. Marcus nodded. It's not just about Amaya. It's about every child who's ever felt they didn't belong. If we're going to call ourselves educators, we owe it to them to do better. Back at home, Amaya sat at the kitchen table, finishing her homework. Marcus walked in, his face tired but resolute. How'd it go? She asked, looking up. We've got a lot of work to do, Marcus admitted, but today was a good start. Amaya smiled. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of hope, not just for herself, but for her school. And though Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, he was determined to make Pinecrest Academy a place where every child could walk into class without fear, knowing they were seen, valued, and protected. 2 weeks later, Pinecrest Academy felt like a different place. Word of what had happened with Mr. Bennett had spread quickly, not just among the students, but throughout the community. His suspension sent a clear message. There was no room for prejudice in the classroom. Amaya walked through the school's hallways with her head held a little higher. She noticed that her classmates looked at her differently now, not with pity, but with a newfound respect. Some of the students who had stayed silent during Mr. Bennett's outburst began to approach her, offering quiet apologies or words of encouragement. Hey, Amaya, a boy named Jacob said one day after class. He had been one of the students who laughed nervously when Mr. Bennett humiliated her. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not standing up for you. It wasn't right. Amaya gave him a small smile. Thanks, Jacob. It means a lot. While the students began to adjust, the teachers were undergoing changes of their own. Marcus's insistence on mandatory diversity and inclusion training had been met with some resistance at first, but it quickly became clear how necessary it was. The sessions were eye-opening for many staff members, sparking conversations about unconscious bias and the ways small actions could have profound impacts on students. One afternoon, Amaya found herself sitting on the swings in the school playground after classes had ended. Her father had a meeting with the principal, so she decided to wait outside, letting the gentle breeze brush against her cheeks. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. She looked up to see Principal Harris, holding a cup of coffee and wearing a kind smile. "Sure," Amaya said, scooting over on the swing to make space. Principal Harris sat down on the swing beside her, his broad frame making it creak slightly. "You've been through a lot these past few weeks," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Amaya said. "It's been hard, but it feels like things are getting better." Harris nodded thoughtfully. "You're braver than most adults I know, Amaya. What you went through, what you stood up against, it's going to make a difference for a lot of kids here." Amaya looked down, kicking at the dirt with her shoe. "Do you think Mr. Bennett will ever change?" The principal was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "Change is hard," he admitted. "But sometimes, when people are forced to face the consequences of their actions, it makes them reflect. I hope Mr. Bennett learns from this. If he doesn't, then he won't be teaching here again." Amaya nodded, feeling a sense of closure. Meanwhile, inside the principal's office, Marcus was wrapping up his final meeting with the leadership team. The investigation into Mr. Bennett had uncovered years of troubling behavior, subtle but consistent patterns of discrimination. It was enough to confirm that his actions were no fluke. "As much as I believe in second chances," Marcus said, looking around the table, "there are some roles where prejudice has no place. Teaching is one of them." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the staff. Principal Harris nodded solemnly. "You're right. We'll begin the process of finding a replacement immediately, and we'll make sure that whoever takes his place understands the responsibility that comes with shaping young minds." Marcus stood, shaking hands with Harris. "Thank you for taking this seriously. This is about more than one teacher. It's about creating a culture where every child feels seen and valued." Harris smiled. "That's the kind of culture I want for this school too. And I have you to thank for pushing us to get there." As Marcus walked back outside, he saw Amaya on the swing set, her face tilted toward the setting sun. She looked peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, truly at ease. "Ready to go, kiddo?" he called out, walking toward her. Amaya hopped off the swing and ran to him, her smile wide. "Yeah, let's go." As they walked to the car, Marcus draped an arm around her shoulders. "You know," he said, "you've taught me a lot through all this." Amaya tilted her head, curious. "Taught you what?" Marcus smiled. "That courage doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's just about standing your ground, even when it feels like the world is against you. You've got more courage in you than most people ever will." Amaya beamed, her heart swelling with pride. "Well, I learned that from you." Marcus laughed softly. "I guess we're both learning from each other, huh?" As they drove home, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The road ahead felt clear and full of promise. Though they knew there would always be challenges, they also knew they had each other, and that was enough to take on anything the world might throw their way.